The rain had been falling since before dawn, a steady, patient drumming that softened the city's edges and turned Paris into a watercolor dream where nothing stayed still long enough to hold its shape. By the time Inspector Moreau crossed the Pont Neuf, the Seine had risen to its dark winter mood, swollen and silent, carrying secrets beneath its surface that even the bargemen pretended not to see. Moreau moved with a certain heaviness that morning. The collar of his coat lifted against the wind, the odor of wet stone rising from the embankment like a memory he did not wish to revisit. He had woken to a telegram from Janvier, urgent, concise, devoid of the usual pleasantries, and that alone had knotted something inconveniently human in his chest. Cases marked urgent at this hour rarely involved living victims. The address was a cramped apartment above a bookshop on Rue des Étuves, a street where the lamps still burned kerosene and the gutters still carried the gossip of the neighborhood from one doorway to the next. The shopkeeper, who served as the morning's unwilling witness, sat trembling beside the body, his fingers stained with ink and fear. A man lay slumped at the small wooden table, rigid, eyes open, hands frozen around a book whose cracked spine suggested it had passed through many owners before ending here in this dim, suffocating room. The book's leather cover glistened from the damp, yet the room itself was dry, and the dead man's expression, almost startled, almost pleading, suggested he had not expected the final sentence he read to be his own. Moreau studied the scene with a stillness that made superiors trust him and suspects fear him. There were no signs of struggle. The window latch was intact, the door had been locked from the inside, and yet something was wrong, so wrong that the inspector felt the weight of it pressing on his ribs. A man does not simply die reading a book unless the book itself carries a shadow, a presence, a history that refuses to stay buried. Moreau leaned closer, his breath brushing the pages, and for a fleeting second, he wondered if the book might whisper its secrets to him too, if it had not already chosen its next reader. If you find yourself drawn into this fog-soaked morning beside Inspector Moreau, lingering in the doorways of Paris with him as he chases the echo of a death that should not have happened, then stay with us. Your presence lets these forgotten streets stay alive. Your attention fuels the lamps of this story. So, if you wish to follow Moreau deeper into the mystery, into the alleys where truth hides behind shutters, remember to like, subscribe, and share the journey with those who savor a good Parisian enigma. The rain had not relented by the time Inspector Moreau stepped through the narrow doorway that led up to the apartment above the bookshop. It clung to his overcoat like a second skin, dripping from the hem as he ascended the creaking steps, each footfall leaving a darker imprint on the worn wood. The air smelled of old paper, damp wool, and something else, an almost metallic stillness that wrapped itself around the building. Moreau paused at the landing, noting the faint haze that drifted in the corridor, as though the lamp's flames struggled to breathe. His hand brushed the iron railing, cool and slick, grounding him in this quiet moment before entering a room where life had so recently withdrawn. Janvier stood outside the door, buttoning his coat in nervous movements, his eyes flicking toward the inspector with a relieved but weary glint. Inside, the apartment was small enough for one breath to touch every corner. The shutters were half-closed, allowing thin strips of grey daylight to slip through and form pale bars across the floor. On the square wooden table near the window sat the body of Émile Laurent, a man in his mid-40s whose last expression had frozen into something disturbingly alive. His eyes were wide. Not in terror, Moreau thought, but in the disbelief of someone who had read a line he wished to reread, only to find time no longer allowed it. One hand rested on the table, palm down, fingers splayed as though reaching for a balance. The other still clutched the book, its cracked leather cover darkened by age and what looked like a faint sheen of moisture. Moreau approached it slowly, letting his gaze travel over every inch of the room before he bent to inspect the corpse. The shopkeeper, a thin man named Théodore Brault, hovered near the stove, twisting his ink-stained handkerchief as if trying to wring out the morning's dread. He had found the body, or so he claimed, when he came upstairs to deliver the post. His voice, when he spoke, trembled like paper lifted by a draught. He was like this when I entered, Monsieur l'Inspecteur. I knocked 3 times. When he did not answer, I feared he had taken ill. Moreau did not look up immediately. He had learned long ago that people often told the truth more readily when they believed the inspector was not fully listening. His eyes moved instead to the small stove where a pot of water still sat, cool and untouched, and the faint aroma of yesterday's stew clung to the pan. The window-sill bore a thin layer of dust except for one small disturbance, a neat, clean semicircle as if someone had rested an object there recently. The room itself appeared undisturbed. No overturned chair, no broken glass, no sign of poison set out carelessly. Moreau inhaled softly. The air carried no trace of bitter almonds or burned matches. Everything suggested that Émile Laurent had simply paused in the middle of his reading and died without protest. Yet instinct tugged at Moreau with a familiar persistence. Death in such circumstances never arrived unaccompanied by a cause, however well concealed. Moreau examined Laurent's face more closely, noting a faint tightness around the mouth, as if a final thought had tried to escape but found no time. His neck bore no marks. His pulse point was cool but not yet icy, suggesting a death that had occurred no more than 2 hours earlier. Janvier cleared his throat gently. "There is no sign of forced entry, Inspector. The door was locked from the inside." Moreau nodded, still crouched beside the corpse, and motioned toward the lock without rising. Janvier moved to it, producing a small ring of tools. "The key is still in it," he added. Moreau finally stood, stretching slightly, the stiffness in his shoulders reminding him that he had not yet completed his first coffee of the day. He stepped to the window and examined the latch. It, too, was secure. Outside, the rain streaked down in restless lines, and the narrow alley below glistened like a darkened mirror. Moreau turned his attention to the book, though he hesitated before touching it. Something about the way it sat in Laurent's stiffened hand felt wrong. It was too deliberately centered on the table, too perfectly aligned with the man's final posture. He leaned closer without yet making contact, allowing his eyes to sweep over its features. The spine bore gold-embossed lettering faded almost to invisibility. The corners were frayed. The edges of the pages were uneven, suggesting either poor craftsmanship or heavy use. But it was the page lying open that captured him. The ink was dense, the lines closely packed, the script antiquated but legible. There was no indication of spilled fluid or damage that might suggest tampering, and yet a faint, almost sweet odor drifted from it, something reminiscent of old varnish or dried sap. Moreau frowned, sensing his thoughts drifting into speculation, and pulled himself back into the steadier rhythm of observation. He turned finally to Bro. The shopkeeper's eyes darted away as though ashamed to meet the inspector's stare. "Did you know Monsieur Laurent well?" Moreau asked. Bro shook his head too quickly. No, only as a customer. He lived here these past months. He was quiet, always reading. Bought books more often than food, I think." Moreau studied the man's posture. Fear radiated from him not merely as the shock of discovering a body, but as though he feared what Moreau might unearth. "Did he purchase this book here?" Bro's reaction was immediate. A swallow, a tightening around the eyes. Yes, he bought it 2 weeks ago. Came in asking for something unusual. I showed him several titles, but he refused all of them until he saw that one." Moreau let the silence stretch. The inspector knew that silence could coax truth from the tightest lips. Finally, Brault whispered, "That book. It came from a crate delivered from the countryside. I had not even catalogued it yet. Just an old collection, dusty, odd-smelling. I plan to sort through them later." Moreau's gaze sharpened. Did anyone else express interest in it? Brault hesitated again, eyes shifting toward the stairwell. A young man, perhaps a student. He asked about it last week, but he left without buying anything. I thought nothing of it. Moreau walked slowly around the room, taking in the small details that revealed how Laurent had lived. A pair of polished but worn shoes near the bed. A coat hung neatly on a peg. A small notebook beside the wash basin with the last entry half finished, the ink still faintly fresh. He lifted the notebook carefully. The final words written there were, "Tonight I will reach the passage they all whispered about. If I do not..." The sentence ended abruptly, the pen having trailed off the page. Moreau's breath tightened slightly in his chest. He slipped the notebook into his coat. The landlady's footsteps echoed from below, heavy and impatient. She appeared at the doorway with the authority of someone who believed the building's secrets were hers to ration. "I heard him moving late last night," she announced without waiting to be asked, her voice thick with the accent of the old courtier. Pacing, muttering. He often spoke to himself, but last night it was different. Faster, as though someone else were in the room with him. Moreau asked her to clarify, but she only shook her head and crossed herself subtly as though regretting having said too much. The inspector stood again by the corpse, his eyes returning to the book. For a moment, he felt as though the room itself leaned in with him, listening. The rain outside seemed quieter, the lamp flame steadier. He reached at last and gently pried the book from Laurent's rigid fingers. The hand released it reluctantly, with a soft crack of stiffened joints. The book felt surprisingly warm, as though it had been held moments earlier. Moreau closed it, the sound of the pages folding together echoing faintly in the enclosed room. He did not open it again. Not yet. Instead, he tucked it under his arm, its weight pressing against him like a thought he could not shake. Outside, the fog thickened along the rooftops, and the inspector felt the peculiar tingle at the base of his spine that marked the beginning of a case unlike others. A death without violence, a book without an author's name, a witness who feared the truth more than he feared lying. Moreau stepped toward the door. Before leaving, he cast one last glance at the table where Laurent had drawn his final breath. Something lingered there. An impression, a pressure, a sense of unfinished meaning. He could almost imagine Laurent's eyes still tracking across the final lines, still trying to understand what he had read. As Moreau descended the stairway, the bookshop below seemed darker, denser, as though the shadows thickened in response to his approach. Brault stood rigid behind the counter, his face pale. Moreau paused at the doorway, the rain waiting for him like an old adversary. He pulled up the collar of his coat, tightened his grip on the book, and stepped out into the narrow street where Paris exhaled in cold mist around him. The case had begun, and already it felt as if the book were reading him as much as he intended to read it. The bell above the shop door gave a weak, melancholy chime as Inspector Moreau stepped inside, the dampness of the street following him in a thin trail that dissolved into the floorboards. The shop was a cavern of books, an uneven maze of leaning shelves that threatened to collapse under the weight of forgotten words. It was colder here than in the room upstairs, despite the cramped stove sputtering softly near the counter. The smell was distinct. Old paper, stale tobacco, and something faintly medicinal, as though the place had once served as an apothecary, before surrendering itself to dust and literature. Moreau paused just inside, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness that pooled between the stacks. Théodore Brault watched him nervously from behind the counter, his hands fidgeting with the ledgers he had abandoned earlier. Moreau approached, setting the book upon the counter with deliberate care. Brault flinched as though the mere sight of it unsettled him. The inspector noticed. He didn't comment. Instead, he let the silence spread, knowing it soon would make Brault talk. "You said Laurent bought it 2 weeks ago," Moreau began quietly, brushing a bead of rain from his glove. "From a crate you had not yet sorted." Brault nodded quickly. Too quickly. Yes, Inspector. It was part of a rather odd collection I purchased from a provincial auction. A widow selling her late husband's belongings. Books, mostly, old ones. Many without proper cataloguing. Moreau leaned slightly forward. Not threatening, simply close enough for his presence to anchor the shopkeeper's wandering eyes. You recall the crate well? Of course, Brault replied, his voice trembling. It was unusual. He paused, biting the inside of his cheek. The books inside smelled strange. Not mold, not dust. Something sharper. When I opened it, I felt... He hesitated, then shook his head. It does not matter. I am not a superstitious man, Inspector. I simply found it unpleasant. Moreau waited. The shopkeeper sighed. When Laurent saw the book, he reached for it immediately, as if he recognized it. Brault's voice lowered to a whisper, but he could not have. I had not even placed it on a shelf. Moreau tapped the book's cover gently. Describe it to me. The crate, the purchase, why you bought it at all. Brault rubbed the bridge of his nose with trembling fingers. The widow insisted the lot be taken as one. She did not want a single volume left behind. The auctioneer pushed it on me for a low price. I thought there might be something valuable hidden among the rubbish. An early edition, a collector's piece. Such things happen, Inspector. People don't always know what they own. And did you find anything valuable? No. Brault swallowed. Nothing but that book, and I am not so sure I should count it. Moreau allowed his gaze to drift across the shop. The shelves sagged with the weight of forgotten editions, pamphlets, and out-of-print novels. A thin layer of dust coated everything except certain paths through the aisles. Paths walked often, perhaps by Laurent in his late-night wanderings. Moreau followed one such path now, moving deeper into the shop, each step releasing the faint squeal of old wood. He paused near a shelf labeled Philosophie et Histoire littéraire, where the books leaned heavily against one another, corners bent, spines cracked. Here, the air felt heavier, as though a draught from somewhere unseen disturbed it. Moreau brushed his hand along the shelf, noting a faint absence of dust in one spot, a rectangular outline where a book had recently rested. He turned back toward Brault. This was its place, he asked. Brault stepped close enough to peer at the shelf. Yes, I believe so. He returned it once. Moreau raised a brow. Returned it. For a day, Brault murmured. He came in early one morning, placed it there, and left without a word. An hour later he returned and asked for it again, but when I offered it he hesitated, as if afraid. Then he took it anyway. Moreau's mind tightened around the peculiar image. Laurent pacing, trembling, unable to decide whether the book belonged in his hands or far from them. Obsession, hesitation, return. A strange cycle for a man described as quiet and unremarkable. Anyone else handle it? Moreau asked. Brault hesitated. I told you, a student came by and asked for it. He had seen Laurent reading it, but when he asked to hold it, Laurent refused. The young man left, angry. He returned once more after that, but Laurent didn't answer the door upstairs. Moreau filed the detail away. Describe the student. Tall, thin, pale. Nervous. Like many students from the Sorbonne who wander in searching for forgotten treasures. He wore spectacles and had the air of someone who reads more letters than he writes. Name? Brault shook his head. He never said. Moreau stepped around the counter and moved toward the crate Brault had mentioned. It sat near the back, half hidden beneath a roll of brown paper and an old scale. Moreau knelt, brushing aside the covering. The crate's wood was dry, stained with age, the nails rusted. A faint smell rose when he lifted the lid, a stale, brittle scent like dried herbs blended with something sharper, almost medicinal. The inspector frowned. It did not smell like a normal book crate. Inside were a few remaining volumes, thin dictionaries, a travelogue, a book of amateur poetry. None seemed remarkable, yet all shared a similar scent, faint but persistent. Moreau lifted one. The paper inside was brittle, the margins annotated in a small, cramped hand. The inscriptions dated back decades. He set it down and reached for another. Again, marginalia. Again, multiple hands. A pattern. Marginalia as inheritance. Marginalia as conversation. Something stirred uneasily in his memory. A name mentioned years ago during a seminar at the École Nationale. Lafargue, the eccentric scholar obsessed with the invisible conversations carried in the margins of old books. Moreau brushed the thought aside for now and closed the crate. He returned to the counter, where Brault stood as if rooted in fear. "Tell me honestly," Moreau said in a tone softened but unmistakably firm. "Did Laurent fear the book?" Brault's throat bobbed in a swallow. "Yes," he whispered, "but not at first. At first he was fascinated. He read it every evening, sometimes long past midnight. Then something changed. He became jumpy. He avoided people. He stopped buying food and came in only to ask if I had acquired more books from the same crate. When I said no, he seemed relieved, or disappointed. I could not tell which. And last night?" Brault wrung the handkerchief between his hands. "Last night I heard footsteps upstairs, heavy ones, but when I went to check this morning..." His eyes swam with dread. "Inspector, I don't think he was alone." Moreau felt rather than heard the tension shift around them, a subtle tightening of the air. He could guess what Janvier would make of it. Nonsense, conjured from nerves. But Moreau had learned long ago that fear, especially the quiet, persistent kind, often pointed toward truths that logic alone missed. He circled back to the book on the counter. Its presence seemed to throb in the dimness of the shop, drawing the inspector's attention with an almost gravitational pull. He rested his fingertips on the cover. It was cool again, no longer warm as it had been upstairs. "Did you read it, Brault?" he asked without looking up. The shopkeeper jerked as though struck. "No, I opened it once, only once. The text, it unsettled me." "In what way?" Brault shook his head, refusing to elaborate. "Inspector, some books are meant to be forgotten, left in crates, left in attics. This one should not have been read." Moreau closed the book gently and slipped it into his coat once more. "Everything can be read," he said quietly. "The question is whether the reader is strong enough to understand what he sees." Brault stared at him, eyes wide, as though unsure whether to take the inspector's words as reassurance or warning. The inspector moved toward the door, pausing only once as he reached for the handle. Outside, the rain had eased to a fine mist that blurred the narrow street in a veil of silver. Before stepping out, he spoke, softly, but with the certainty of a man who had begun to feel the edges of a mystery closing around him. "I'll need the names of everyone who visited the shop in the last fortnight." Brault's face drained of its remaining color, but he nodded. As Moreau left the shop, the bell chimed again. This time a sharper, more insistent sound, as though the building itself were trying to voice a warning. The inspector ignored it. The book felt heavier under his arm, its shape a persistent impression against his ribs. The city awaited him outside, its fog rolling low over the cobblestones, as if Paris itself were preparing to swallow whatever truth the book carried. And as he crossed back into the street, Moreau could not shake the strange sensation that the bookshop's shadows had watched him leave, holding their breath until he disappeared into the mist. The morning train to Saint-Aubin rattled through the countryside with a tired persistence, as though it too felt the weight of the grey winter pressing against its windows. Inspector Moreau sat alone in a compartment whose seat smelled faintly of damp wool and old newspapers. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the rails lulled the other passengers into a quiet half-sleep, but it sharpened Moreau's thoughts instead of softening them. He rested the mysterious book on the bench beside him, wrapped now in brown paper, though he felt its presence through the layers, as one feels the eyes of someone seated just behind them. He had not opened it again, not on instinct nor on caution, but because something inside him seemed to recoil whenever his fingers drifted near the cover. Outside, the landscape unfurled in muted strokes of brown fields, bare orchards, and the occasional cluster of houses whose chimneys exhaled long trails of smoke. The provincial air looked calmer than Paris's churning fog, yet Moreau sensed a different kind of heaviness in it, the heaviness of secrets that had settled over time, like dust in untouched rooms. He watched the fields blur into one another and tried to imagine the life of the widow whose belongings had seeded this case, a woman who had locked away her husband's books, yet insisted they be sold as one lot, as though separation might awaken something she feared. When the train slowed into Saint-Aubin, Moreau stepped onto the platform and inhaled deeply. The air smelled of coal smoke, wet soil, and the faint bitterness of the cafe across the square. The station was small, its yellow walls chipped and its clock stuck at 9:01, although Moreau's pocket watch insisted it was 10:30. A few villagers lingered near the bench, staring at him with the quiet curiosity reserved for city men arriving unannounced. Moreau adjusted his coat, nodded politely, and began the walk toward the widow's house. Saint-Aubin was a town that carried its history in the silence between footsteps. The cobblestones were uneven, the houses leaning slightly inward as if they whispered to one another across narrow streets. Laundry fluttered from windows despite the damp, and a dog barked lazily from behind a gate. Moreau followed the directions given in Breaux's ledger, the path leading him past the churchyard, where moss-covered gravestones pressed together like a congregation of forgotten ancestors, and finally toward a house perched on a slope just beyond the town's quieter edge. The widow, Madame Lemaitre, lived in a structure that seemed older than the street itself. Its shutters were closed, its garden overgrown with brittle vines, and its fence missing a latch. Moreau passed through the gate, feeling the crunch of dead leaves beneath his boots, and knocked twice on the wooden door. A moment later, a soft shuffling sounded from within, followed by the scrape of a chair and then the slow opening of the door. Madame Lemaitre was smaller than he expected, wrapped in a wool shawl that clung to her frail shoulders. Her hair, silver and thin, was pinned tightly at the back of her head, and her eyes, sharp despite the softness of age, looked up at him with the wariness of someone who had grown too accustomed to unwelcome news. "Yes?" she asked, her voice low and deliberate. Moreau introduced himself, removing his hat politely, and explained that he wished to ask a few questions about the books she had sold from her late husband's estate. Her expression tightened at the mention, not in grief, but in something closer to caution. Still, after a pause, she stepped aside and gestured him in. The interior of the house smelled of lavender and locked rooms. The curtains were drawn, allowing only a thin ribbon of light to slip through the fabric, making the parlor appear like a half-remembered dream. Moreau followed her into the sitting room where a small stove crackled, more for comfort than for heat. She motioned for him to sit. "I thought all that was behind me," she said, folding her hands atop her shawl. "I wanted it behind me." Moreau nodded gently. "I apologize for disturbing your peace, madame, but one of the books you sold has drawn my attention. A man in Paris died while reading it." Her eyes flickered, barely, but enough for Moreau to register. "Died?" she repeated, her voice hollow. "How?" "In his chair, without a struggle, without a mark." The book was open in his hands. A tremor passed over her features, though she tried to hide it by adjusting the shawl around her shoulders. "Do you recognize this?" Moreau unwrapped the brown paper slowly, revealing the edge of the leather binding. He did not fully reveal the book, but the widow stiffened the instant she saw enough to know what it was. "I never should have let those books leave this house," she whispered. "Not because they were valuable. They weren't. but because they were tainted. The word hovered in the air, carrying more weight than superstition alone. "Tell me about your husband," Moreau said quietly. She sighed, as if exhaling the past itself. Henri was a quiet man, a scholar of sorts, not recognized by universities, but devout in his own studies. He believed that the margins of old books carried truths forgotten by their authors. Commentaries, warnings, conversations across time. He spent hours reading those scribbles, sometimes muttering them aloud as though answering unseen voices. Moreau listened carefully. "And this particular book?" Her lips tightened. It was his favorite, his curse. After he acquired it, he grew distant, restless. He stopped sleeping. Some nights he wandered through this house speaking to someone who wasn't there, arguing with them, pleading with them. He became afraid of the shadows and corners he once ignored. And then, her voice cracked. He stopped eating, stopped speaking. The day he died, the book lay open beside him, and he had written nothing for the first time in months. Moreau leaned forward slightly. "Written," she nodded. He filled notebooks, dozens, commenting on the book's passages, interpreting the marginalia. Some entries are lucid, others— she shook her head. "Others are not." "May I see them?" Moreau asked. She hesitated a moment longer than expected, then stood slowly and shuffled toward a tall cabinet with a key still hanging from the lock. When she opened it, Moreau saw the notebooks stacked neatly inside, their edges worn from frequent handling. She selected one from the bottom, as though choosing the most honest account. He opened it carefully. The first pages contained tidy interpretations of obscure sentences, philosophical reflections woven with literary curiosity. But as he turned farther, the handwriting grew jagged, the letters sprawling across the margins like roots reaching for something beneath the soil. Certain phrases repeated themselves. "It follows me," and "voices" in the margins. And most troubling, "If I cannot stop reading, it will finish me." Moreau closed the notebook softly. Why sell the books if they frightened you? Madame Lemaitre stared into the embers of the stove. "Because keeping them frightened me more. After Henry's death, I locked them away, but the house, it felt heavy, as though the books were waiting, watching. I wanted them gone, all of them, together, so that whatever held them might leave with them." A long, still silence settled over the room. Moreau stood and bowed his head respectfully. "I appreciate your honesty, madame. You have helped more than you know." She nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "Inspector, be careful. The book does not harm the strong of mind. It harms the vulnerable, those who carry quiet fears, those who read too deeply." Moreau felt the weight of her words but did not show it. He wrapped the book once more and stepped toward the door. As he crossed the threshold, the widow called after him. "Do not read the final page," she said. "My husband reached it the night before he died." Moreau paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The admonition lingered in the air like a final breath. He did not answer. Instead, he stepped outside into the cold afternoon, where the sky hung low and pale, and the wind carried the scent of distant rain. As he walked back toward the train station, he felt something he rarely allowed himself: unease. Not fear, not yet, but a faint trembling in the quiet part of the mind where instinct lives. He tightened his grip on the wrapped book, feeling its edges like the outline of a presence. Saint-Aubin watched him leave through half-closed shutters. The dogs barked again. The bells in the church tower rang once, too softly, too strangely, and Moreau found himself wondering whether the widow had spoken from superstition or from memory. The train awaited him like a silent witness, steam hissing through its valves. Moreau boarded, took his seat, and stared at the package beside him. The countryside began to roll past. For the first time since the case had begun, he felt as though the book was not simply evidence. It was an invitation. Inspector Moreau returned to Paris with the winter dusk following him like a slow-moving tide. By the time the train pulled into Gare d'Austerlitz, a thin veil of fog had already begun to settle over the city, softening its lines and muffling its noise until everything seemed suspended in an uneasy stillness. The inspector stepped down onto the platform, the wrapped book tucked firmly beneath his arm, and felt immediately the shift in atmosphere. The Parisian kind of tension that crept between stones and alleyways, whispering that the city had been waiting for him to return. He did not go home. Instead, he took a cab directly to the Quai des Orfèvres, where the lamps burned low and a night clerk nodded oddly at him, as though relieved to see a familiar face. The inspector's office sat near the far end of the corridor, a modest room with a wide desk, 2 stiff-backed chairs, and a window overlooking the Seine's restless darkness. Tonight, the river looked almost black. The lamps along its banks were swallowed by fog, leaving only shimmering reflections in the water below. Moreau removed his coat, hung it neatly on the rack, and cleared the clutter from his desk. Only when the space was empty, utterly barren of distraction, did he set the book at the center, the brown wrapping still intact. He stood over it for several minutes, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the desk, as though contemplating a delicate piece of evidence that might react to sudden movement. At last he removed the paper, folded it, and placed it aside. The book seemed to exhale, its leather cover flexing faintly, releasing that faint scent he had noticed before. Varnish, dried sap, old ink. A scent that did not belong to Paris. Moreau sat, rolled up his sleeves, and opened a fresh notebook. He did not trust himself to rely solely on memory. Whatever lay within these pages, he wanted distance, analytical distance, even if the widow had warned him that such distance might collapse the deeper he went. He opened the book. The first pages were familiar. Printed text, neat and orderly, the voice of the long-forgotten author, guiding the reader into whatever narrative or reflection he had intended. But the inspector's attention immediately drifted to the margins. They were not blank. Thin lines of handwriting curved along the edges like vines, some in precise, elegant script, others in hurried, jagged strokes. Still others faded to the point of transparency. Moreau leaned closer, tracing one line with his eyes. It begins here, but not where he thinks. He flipped ahead. Another margin. She warned him, yet he refused to listen. And farther still, look at the shadows between the lines. He sat back. The annotations did not comment on the text itself, not in the conventional sense. They spoke about the story, but from another vantage point, as though the reader who wrote them believed himself inside the book or believed the book was somehow inside him. Moreau read on. The first 100 pages felt like a quiet descent, a story within a story. The author's voice was calm, methodical, almost hypnotic. The margin notes, however, grew increasingly frayed. Some passages contradicted each other. One reader had written, "This is where it began for him. Don't let it begin for you." Another, much later, had responded on a different date. Too late. Moreau exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. This was not conventional commentary. This was a conversation, scattered, fragmented, spanning decades. It was as though each owner had left a warning, or a confession, or a map of their unraveling, and each appeared to respond to what the previous reader had written, as though the margins themselves held dialogues that no one could fully control. He turned toward the notebook he kept at his side, and began to write. Marginalia is layered. Multiple authors. Distinct handwriting styles. Tone shifts from curiosity to agitation. Notes imply a shared experience among readers. Psychological effect, collective delusion, intentional manipulation of narrative. His pen slowed. He stared again at the old book. The widow's words returned. He answered voices that weren't there. Moreau leaned forward and resumed reading. Around page 200, the annotations changed tone entirely. They became sharper, shorter, more desperate. He is watching. Do not look at the next line too long. It is not fiction. He paused. The widow's husband had written similar lines, and the dead man, Laurent, had left a final unfinished entry hinting at a particular passage whispered about by unknown they. Moreau turned more pages. His pulse quickened despite his attempts to maintain objectivity. He felt a slight ache behind his eyes, the kind born of reading in dim lamplight for too long, yet the lamp on his desk was bright, uncomfortably bright. He blinked and pressed onward. At one point, the margins were filled entirely, the text boxed in by frantic commentary. The notes circled the paragraphs, arrows connecting ideas like threads in a conspiracy. One sentence unspooled across the entire edge. The narrative turns inward here. Do not let it take you with it. He inhaled deeply. The room felt colder. Taking a breath, he turned to the midpoint, the place where marginalia became dense enough to appear like a map of someone's deteriorating sanity. There he found the widow's handwriting. He recognized it immediately from her husband's notebooks. She had written in the book only once, a single line. I begged him to stop. Moreau closed his eyes. That sentence carried more weight than any other. Not because of what it revealed about her husband, but because it suggested she had read enough of the book to understand its pull. Yet she had not written again, as though adding more would invite something into her home. He opened the book again, now searching for something else, something hidden beneath the text. He tilted the page. There, faint but visible, were impressions left by a hand pressing hard with a pen but writing nothing. Someone had dug the tip into the paper, leaving invisible words made visible only by the right angle of light. Moreau took out a soft pencil and lightly brushed the edge of the impression. Letters formed. It will finish what it starts. A chill ran up his spine. He reminded himself firmly that this was not supernatural. This was the residue of troubled minds, of coincidence stacked upon coincidence like bricks of a crumbling wall. Yet even as he framed it rationally, a part of him felt the electric whisper of unease. He needed to know how far it went. He flipped to the last pages. The handwriting here was different, more deliberate, more elegant. A careful script that stood out from the others. Lafargue's. Possibly. One line towered above all others. The final sentence is not what it seems. Moreau hesitated, his thumb resting on the edge. He remembered the widow's warning. Do not read the final page. He remembered Laurent's unfinished note. He remembered the widow's husband, found with the book open. But he was not a man easily swayed by fear or folklore. His profession required stepping into the psychological storms of others without letting their madness bleed into him. Still, he paused. He read the text leading up to the final sentence. He found nothing unusual. The narrative tapered gently, like any old novel coming to its end. But then he saw it, the final line. It was simple, almost banal. And yet, Moreau blinked. He reread it. It was the same, and yet not the same. His breath shallowed, not from fear, but from the sudden, inexplicable sense that the sentence had altered its tone, as though reading it twice had changed its intention. He closed the book abruptly, hand steady but jaw tightening. It was not possible. And yet the imprint of the sentence lingered in his thoughts like a whisper. He turned to his notebook and wrote, The final line appears altered on second reading. Psychological effect, suggestion, sleep, deprivation, or structural device intended to be read twice. Investigate known editions for comparison. He set the notebook aside. Outside his office window, the fog rolled thicker over the river. The lamps flickered. Somewhere, a horn sounded faintly. Inside the room, the book sat quietly. Too quietly. Moreau leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, and stared at the closed volume. He felt none of the panic that had undone Laurent or the widow's husband, but he felt watched, not by a presence, but by an idea. The idea that the book did not simply touch those who read it too deeply, but that it selected them. His gaze hardened. Whatever lay behind its creation, whoever had designed its margins, its structure, its psychological architecture, was still out there. And Moreau intended to find him. He extinguished the lamp, gathered his coat, and left the office. But as he stepped into the corridor, he glanced once more at the desk. The book sat where he left it. But for a fleeting moment, as the shadows shifted across the room, it looked slightly open. Paris woke late the next morning, as though the fog had pressed too heavily on its rooftops for the city to rise at its usual hour. Inspector Moreau walked through the courtyard of the Quai des Orfèvres with the guarded stillness of a man deep in thought, his collar lifted against the cold, his breath forming brief ghosts that vanished before he reached the steps. The book remained locked in his desk upstairs, the key in his coat pocket, yet he felt its presence hovering behind him like a thought that refused to be dismissed. He entered the building and nodded to Janvier, who awaited him with 2 cups of coffee, one of which Moreau accepted with a faint sound of gratitude. The young inspector studied him closely, perhaps sensing the fatigue beneath Moreau's steady exterior. But Janvier had learned long ago that questions asked too soon tended to close doors rather than open them. So he followed Moreau silently into the office until the inspector spoke. "We need to find someone," Moreau said, unbuttoning his coat. "A man named Joseph Lafargue. Scholar, researcher, eccentric, possibly delusional." Janvier blinked. "I don't know the name." "You wouldn't," Moreau replied, setting down his coffee. "But the Sorbonne remembers him, and so do a few antiquarian booksellers. He was—" Moreau searched for the right word, fascinated by marginalia, by the words readers leave behind. He believed they formed hidden dialogues across generations. "Is he connected to the book?" "More than connected," Moreau murmured. "I believe he once possessed it, perhaps even altered it." Janvier frowned. "Altered how, exactly?" Moreau hesitated. He did not want to describe the final sentence, nor the unsettling shift he thought he had perceived in it. Handwritten notes, patterns, psychological manipulation. Not magic, not superstition. Intentional framing. Subtle. Suggestion. He rubbed his temple. If Lafargue designed even part of what lies in those margins, we need to understand his purpose. Janvier nodded slowly. "Where do we begin?" The Sorbonne. The university's stone facade loomed over the Latin Quarter like a stern guardian of old knowledge. Moreau and Janvier entered through the side gate, the echo of their footsteps swallowed by thick walls and long corridors. A porter led them to an office lined with shelves of manuscripts and towers of paper that resembled miniature barricades. Professor Delmas sat behind a desk buried under so many documents that only the crown of his head and the smoke of his pipe could be seen before he looked up. "Inspector Moreau," he said, adjusting his spectacles, "I heard whispers you were asking about Lafargue. It's been years since anyone spoke his name without discomfort." Moreau asked, "Why discomfort?" "Because he was brilliant," Delmas replied, leaning back in his chair as though bracing himself against old memories. Brilliant men make others uneasy when they begin to slip. Lafargue had an extraordinary mind. Linguistics, psychology, literature, but he crossed boundaries best left untouched. He believed books were not static objects, but living dialogues. He claimed the margins carried the true text. Moreau exchanged a glance with Janvier. Delmas continued, "He spent years tracing handwritten notes between copies of the same works. He insisted that certain readers responded to each other unknowingly, leaving messages across decades. He said he could prove that marginalia shaped not only interpretation, but emotion. Emotion, Janvier asked skeptically. Yes, Delmas said. He argued that a sufficiently crafted structure of marginal notes could guide a reader's state of mind, plant ideas, trigger anxieties, even induce obsession. Moreau leaned forward. Did any of his colleagues believe him? None publicly, Delmas replied with a sigh. But privately, some admired his persistence. Others pitied him. A few feared him. He became convinced he was close to a breakthrough, something to do with a single book he'd been annotating over the years, a book that traveled from owner to owner. Moreau felt the air tighten. Do you know where Lafargue is now? Delmas hesitated. He vanished. One day he simply stopped attending lectures, stopped writing letters, stopped sending annotated pages to colleagues. There was talk of scandal, rumors of falsified manuscripts. But the truth? No one knows. And the book he was working on? The professor grew still. I heard it passed through several hands after he disappeared. Booksellers whispered about it. Students swore it unnerved them. One claimed he found notes in the margins responding directly to thoughts he had while reading. Delmas shook his head. Of course, most of it was nonsense. Young minds playing at hysteria. Moreau did not respond. Instead, he lifted his coffee cup and allowed the silence to gather weight. Then he asked the question he had been saving. Did Lafargue ever speak of a final line? Something he believed could change or be interpreted differently depending on the reader. Delmas's pipe froze halfway to his mouth. Yes, he whispered. He believed the final sentence of any book was the most powerful weapon a writer possessed. He said a closing line could rewrite everything that came before. But in his case, I think he wanted a sentence that could rewrite the reader. Janvier's breath caught. Moreau remained expressionless. Where can we find him? Moreau repeated. Delmas gestured vaguely toward the window. If he is alive, he will be among the forgotten, among the places where people with damaged pride and fragile minds retreat. Look to the small cafes at the edge of the river. Look to the cheap boarding houses. Look to the shadows. Moreau and Janvier thanked him and left. The fog grew thicker as they walked toward the Seine. The lamps glowed weakly, their halos diffusing into pale circles on the pavement. Along the Quai Saint-Michel, the inspector noticed a narrow doorway framed by peeling paint and a dim lantern. An old cafe that looked as though it had never closed, only faded. Inside, the air was heavy with tobacco and the murmur of low conversation. Moreau stepped to the bar and asked the owner, a broad-shouldered man polishing glasses, if he recognized the name Joseph Lafargue. The man paused. Lafargue, he echoed. The quiet one, pale as parchment, sat in the corner scribbling in notebooks, always muttering. He leaned closer. He came here often, until the night he left everything behind. When? Moreau asked. 3 years ago. Maybe more. He was anxious, frantic. Ordered a drink, never touched it. Kept glancing over his shoulder. Then he walked out into the fog and never returned. Moreau asked, Did he leave anything? The owner shook his head at first, then stopped. Wait. He crouched below the counter and rummaged through a drawer. He returned with a thin envelope yellowed by time. He asked me to hold this for someone who would come eventually. Never said who. Moreau took it cautiously. Inside were 2 items, a photograph and a note. The photograph showed Lafargue, thin, hollow-cheeked, eyes too bright, standing beside the very book Moreau now possessed. His hand rested on it like an artist touching his creation. His expression was calm but unsettling, as though he believed the camera could not possibly understand what it captured. The note was worse. To the one who finds this, you cannot save them. The book does not destroy the body. It destroys the certainty that keeps the mind steady. Do not read the sentence twice. Moreau folded the note with deliberate calm and slipped it into his coat. He thanked the cafe owner and stepped back into the fog. Janvier trailing silently behind him. Neither spoke until they reached the river. Then Janvier asked, his voice tight, "Do you believe him?" Moreau looked across the water. "I believe," he said quietly, "that the man who wrote this note understood exactly what he created." And as they walked back toward the Quai des Orfèvres, Moreau felt the dread he had been holding at bay slide closer, like a shadow keeping pace beside him, matching his steps, matching his breath, waiting for him to read again. The fog that settled over Paris the next morning was not the gentle kind that softened rooftops and turned the Seine into a muted ribbon of grey. This fog was heavier, purposeful, as though it had risen from the riverbed with a mind of its own, curling through the streets and alleys with quiet insistence. Inspector Moreau stood at his window in the Quai des Orfèvres, watching the faint lanterns along the river flicker like distant memories. The city moved beneath the fog in half-seen shapes, boats drifting, vendors pushing carts, pedestrians reduced to silhouettes. The world felt thinned, like parchment stretched to its limit. He had not slept well. Lafargue's note refused to leave his thoughts. Do not read the sentence twice. What kind of scholar wrote such a warning, and what kind of book required it? Moreau rubbed his eyes, feeling the dull ache of fatigue settle behind them. On his desk lay newspapers folded neatly, though their headlines were anything but calm. Word had begun to spread, half truth, half rumor, about a strange death connected to a disturbing manuscript. Parisian journalists, hungry for mystery and scandal, had transformed the incident on Rue des Étuves into something nearly mythical. One paper suggested the book was cursed. Another argued it was part of a wider conspiracy among intellectuals. A third simply asked if reading itself had become dangerous in modern times. The inspector exhaled through his nose. He knew the city, knew how quickly it spun stories from shadows, but this time the frenzy felt directed, as though someone wanted the public looking in the wrong direction. A knock sounded at his door. Janvier entered, holding 2 telegrams, thin slips of paper trembling between his fingers. "These arrived within minutes of each other," the young inspector said. "Both anonymous." Moreau took them without comment. The first read, "Stop reading, stop, stop, stop." The second was more elaborate. "Leave the book where it belongs, or it will choose another." Moreau folded the telegram slowly, deliberately, as one folds a letter that might crumble if touched too quickly. He placed it atop Lafargue's note inside his desk drawer. His instincts sharpened. Whoever sent these had been tracking his movements closely. They knew he had the book. They knew he was reading it, and they feared what he might uncover next. Janvier shifted uneasily. "Inspector, perhaps we should assign an officer to watch your office." "I don't need a nursemaid," Moreau said softly, without anger. "No," Janvier replied after a moment, "but someone clearly wishes to frighten you." Moreau reached for his coat. "Then perhaps it is time we give them an opportunity to try." He left the office and stepped out into the fog-wrapped city. The cold bit at his skin, and the damp seeped through his coat as he walked along the quay. He passed the bookstores, deserted now, their tarps pulled tight against the mist, and followed the river toward the narrow bridge where Lafargue had once been seen muttering to himself. Moreau paused there, watching the water churn below, as though the river itself struggled to swallow the stories people cast into it. Someone was watching him. He did not see the figure at first, only felt the faint tug of awareness along the back of his neck, the instinct that had saved him more than once. He turned slowly. A man stood beneath the street lamp at the bridge's end, his coat long, his hat pulled low, his posture rigid. He held a parcel wrapped in brown paper, the same kind Moreau had used to wrap the book. The inspector walked toward him with steady steps, but as he neared, the figure retreated into the fog. Moreau followed, but the shadows consumed the man swiftly, leaving no trace except the faint echo of footsteps dissolving into the mist. This was not coincidence. Someone knew the path he would take. Someone wanted him to see the parcel, an imitation of the one he carried as a message. But a message from whom? He turned back toward the bridge, his jaw tight, and began walking again. Paris felt restless, every alley a mouth whispering half-truths. By midday, he found himself near the Café de la Lune Rousse, one of the river-facing establishments known for its clientele of writers, students, and wanderers. The windows glowed dimly from within, and the clinking of glasses floated onto the street. Inside, the café smelled of burnt sugar, bitter coffee, and pipe tobacco. Moreau slid into a corner booth, removed his gloves, and ordered a black coffee. He watched the room. Conversations drifted around him in fragments, each carrying hints of the city's mounting fascination with the mysterious book. A woman at the counter whispered to her companion, "They say the book drives men mad." A man in a worn coat murmured, "A curse or a test." A group of students debated the psychological effects of literature, throwing around theories with an arrogance that made Moreau's lips twitch faintly. He had seen this before, Paris feeding on rumor until it swelled into something unstoppable. The cafe owner approached quietly. "Inspector Moreau." Moreau looked up. He recognized the man, Monsieur Girard, who had spoken of Lafargue the day before in another arrondissement. That alone was strange enough. Cafe owners rarely left their domains. "You should not be here today," Girard said, lowering his voice. "Not when the city is stirring the way it is." Moreau tilted his head. "And why is that?" "Because when people begin fearing stories, Inspector, they stop thinking clearly." Girard glanced around the cafe. Someone stirs this fear intentionally. Someone who knows that a whisper can travel faster than truth. Moreau leaned forward. "Do you know who?" "I know only that the ones who fear the book are not the ones who should fear it." Girard stepped back. "And that Lafargue, if he still lives, would not want his work turned into a ghost story." Before Moreau could question him further, Girard slipped into the kitchen, leaving behind the bitter scent of roasted coffee beans and unanswered questions. Moreau finished his drink and stepped back outside. The fog had thickened, swallowing the edges of the street. Sound muffled into a distant hum. Somewhere far away, a church bell tolled. Not with clarity, but as a dull vibration that seemed to sink into the fog rather than cut through it. He walked toward the river once more, his senses sharp, his footsteps slow. The mist curled around him like fingers. And then, a child's voice called out, "Monsieur!" Moreau turned. A young girl stood by a lamp-post, holding a telegram with both hands. Her coat was too large for her, and her shoes were soaked. She looked up at him with large, uncertain eyes. "Are you Inspector Moreau?" she whispered. "Yes." She handed him the telegram and ran off before he could ask who sent her. Moreau opened it. The message was longer this time. "You are being followed by two types of people, the ones who want the book away from you and the ones who want you to finish it. Both are dangerous." Moreau folded the paper, feeling the weight of Paris pressing closer. The fog was no longer simply weather. It was cover, for watchers, for messengers, for those who knew where he walked. He resumed his path along the river, one hand in his coat pocket resting lightly on the book's outline through the fabric. The fog thickened. A shape moved near the water, another on the bridge. Shadows shifted in impossible ways. Paris was no longer whispering about the book. It was whispering at him, and Moreau understood, finally, that the city itself had become part of the case. The fog did not clear as he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres. If anything, it followed him, pooling at his feet like something alive, something waiting. He mounted the steps, turned the corner of the corridor, and felt again that tug of awareness at his back. Someone was inside his office. He opened the door. and froze. The book, which he had locked away, lay open on his desk, on the final page. Inspector Moreau did not step into the room at once. He remained in the doorway, one hand on the knob, letting the silence breathe around him. The fog that had clung to his coat seeped into the office's dimness, giving the illusion that the room itself exhaled in slow, heavy breaths. The book lay open on the desk exactly where he had not left it, the final page exposed like a wound. The lamplight fell across the margin, illuminating the faint imprint of words that had not been there before. Moreau stepped forward at last, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. His boots left soft imprints across the rug as he moved to the desk. He did not touch the book immediately. He circled the room first, inspecting every corner. The window latch was intact, the filing cabinet undisturbed, the drawers closed. No footprints on the floor, no lingering scent of an intruder. Yet the presence of someone, or something, hung in the air like fading perfume. He returned to the desk, bending slightly to examine the open page. The final line stared back at him. He felt his pulse quicken, not in fear, but in the instinctive tightening before revelation. The sentence appeared unchanged from before, but he sensed a difference the way one senses a shifting weight in an unbalanced room. The margins behind it bore a new marking, faint but unmistakable. Not ink. Pressure, as if someone had traced words with a fingernail rather than a pen. He tilted the page under the lamplight. A message took shape. "Do not let him speak." Moreau straightened, his jaw tightening. He knew now the intruder had not come to steal the book. They had come to warn him, or to mislead him, or perhaps both. A soft knock broke the silence. Janvier opened the door a crack. "Inspector, I saw the light." Moreau gestured him in quietly. "Close the door." Janvier obeyed, stepping closer when he saw the open book. "Did you leave it like that?" "No." The young inspector paled slightly. "Then someone—" "Yes." Moreau's voice remained calm, anchored. "Someone has been inside this room, someone with a message." Moreau tapped the indentation in the margin. Janvier leaned closer and read it aloud, barely above a whisper. "Do not let him speak." "Who? Lafargue?" Moreau did not answer immediately. He stared at the faint message long enough for Janvier to shift nervously before he responded. "No, not Lafargue." He inhaled deeply. "Someone else read this book before Laurent. Someone Laurent sought. Someone who now follows us." Janvier frowned. "But who?" "The student Bro mentioned," Moreau said. "The one who came looking for the book. The one Laurent refused to share it with." Janvier blinked. "You think he's been following you?" "I know he has." Moreau closed the book firmly, the sound sharp in the stillness. "Fetch the night watchman. Ask if anyone has entered this corridor in the last hour." Janvier hurried out. Moreau remained standing over the closed volume, breathing steadily, grounding himself in the room's familiar elements. The weight of the lamp, the pattern of scratches on the desk, the faint hum of the building settling. He was not a man easily rattled. But tonight, something had shifted. Someone had crossed a boundary. When Janvier returned, the night watchman trailed him, rubbing his eyes. "No one's come through here," he insisted. "Not a soul. I would have seen the door open." Moreau considered the man carefully. "You're certain?" "As certain as I am breathing." Moreau dismissed him and the watchman shuffled off, muttering under his breath. Janvier stayed, hovering. "Inspector, if no one entered, how did the book—" Moreau raised a hand. "Books do not move on their own. Someone entered. They simply knew how to avoid being seen." Janvier swallowed but nodded. "Go home, Janvier. You've done enough tonight." The younger man hesitated, then quietly left. When Moreau was alone again, he locked the door, not out of fear, but to remove distraction. He sat in his chair, leaning forward with his elbows on the desk, staring at the closed book. The room darkened as the fog pressed against the windows. The inspector let the silence settle until his breathing slowed. Then he spoke aloud, not to the book, but to the room itself. "If you wish to warn me," he murmured, "you should not have broken into a police office to do so." A faint creak answered him. Moreau rose instantly. Someone was in the corridor. The inspector crossed to the door in 3 quiet steps and opened it sharply. The hallway appeared empty, except for a thin figure standing motionless at the far end, barely visible through the fog that had seeped through the old windows. Moreau stepped forward, his gaze locked on the shape. The figure tensed, then turned and bolted down the stairs. Moreau followed. He descended quickly, his footfalls echoing off stone, but the figure moved with uncanny speed, disappearing around corners just as Moreau reached them. The inspector reached the courtyard to find the gates open, the fog curling through them like pale smoke. He stepped outside. A silhouette stood beneath a street lamp across the street, the same one he had seen earlier, the parcel still in hand. Moreau approached, slower this time, measured. "You've been following me," he said when he was close enough for his voice to carry. The figure turned. The man was young, mid-20s, pale, trembling, eyes wild with sleeplessness. His coat was soaked, and his spectacles glinted with raindrops. "I wasn't following," the man stammered. "I was protecting." Moreau studied him. "You're the student, the one who asked Brault about the book." The man nodded jerkily. "He wouldn't let me have it." "Laurent? He said it wasn't my turn yet." "Your turn?" Moreau repeated. The student swallowed hard. "It passes between readers. It always has. I only wanted to understand what Lafargue created. He wasn't mad. Not in the way they said. He discovered something real, something about how stories speak to us, how they shape us, how we shape them back." The man clutched the parcel tighter. But Laurent, he read too, quickly, too deeply. The book saw something in him, something fragile. Moreau felt a chill. What did Lafargue intend? The young man's throat bobbed. To prove a point, that a narrative can reshape a mind if guided correctly. He built marginalia like pathways, breadcrumbs, suggestions. He wanted to test whether a reader could be led from one thought to another without knowing they were being guided. "And why warn me to silence him?" The young man looked terrified. "Because if you find him..." His voice dropped. "Lafargue isn't the same. He isn't teaching anymore. He isn't living anymore. Not truly. He reads, and reads, and reads. And if he speaks to you, the book will have a voice again." Moreau's eyes sharpened. "Where is he?" The student choked on the words. I shouldn't say. They're watching. All of them. The professors, the sellers, the ones who read and survived. They want the book destroyed, or completed. And you..." He pointed a shaking finger at Moreau. "You're the first reader strong enough to reach the end without breaking." Moreau stepped closer, voice low but steady. "Where is Lafargue?" The student trembled violently. "In the attic rooms above the old baindery on Rue des Amandiers. But you must not go alone. He doesn't know the difference between the book and life anymore." Moreau absorbed the information silently. Then he extended a hand, not threatening, but firm, steady. "Come with me to the quay. You'll be safe there." The student stepped back, shaking his head. "No, I can't. They'll know. They always know." He pressed the parcel into Moreau's hands. This was his last message. I found it in the bindery. Before Moreau could stop him, the young man fled into the fog, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Moreau looked down at the parcel. Slowly, carefully, he unwrapped it. Inside lay a single sheet of paper in Lafargue's elegant handwriting. The reader decides the ending. Moreau closed the parcel, feeling the night tighten around him like a noose. The book was no longer a curiosity. It was a crossroads. And the man who wrote it was waiting for him. Rue des Amandiers lay on the far eastern edge of Paris, where the city began to thin into a quieter sprawl of workshops, modest cafes, and the lingering scent of coal smoke from the factories beyond. Inspector Moreau walked alone beneath the faint shimmer of street lamps that fought valiantly against the fog. The damp air clung to him, weaving through the folds of his coat, while the wrapped parcel in his hand felt heavier with each step. The book remained locked in his office, yet its absence seemed impossible. Its weight hovered like a phantom at his side, as though the mere touch of it had imprinted itself on his ribs. The bindery stood at the end of a narrow lane, its windows dark, its wooden sign faded to illegibility. Moreau entered the courtyard, quietly, the crunch of gravel underfoot sounding too loud, as if the night itself preferred silence. An iron staircase spiraled upward along the exterior wall. He ascended it slowly, hand grazing the cold railing, until he reached a door whose paint peeled like shedding bark. He knocked once. No answer. He knocked again. From within came a faint rustle, paper shifting, fabric brushing wood, the hesitant movements of someone uncertain whether they wished to be found. Moreau waited. At last the door opened a fraction, revealing only one darkened eye, bright with the feverish gleam of a man who had not slept in days. "Lafargue," Moreau said softly. The door opened farther. The scholar's thin face emerged from the shadows, gaunt to the point of translucence. His hair fell in disheveled strands, his coat hung loosely from his shoulders, and his hands trembled with an agitation that seemed internal rather than physical. Yet his voice, when it came, was calm, too calm. "You have the book," Lafargue said, though Moreau carried only the parcel. "It is locked away safely," the inspector replied. Lafargue nodded, as though this confirmed something he had long suspected. "Then come in." The room was dim, lit by a single oil lamp whose flame flickered erratically. Piles of papers and old bindings cluttered every surface. Books lay open on the floor in chaotic circles, their pages creased, their margins scribbled with frantic notes. Moreau stepped inside carefully, avoiding the scattered manuscripts. The air smelled of dust, ink, and the faint sourness of stale tea. Lafargue sat at a small desk near the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. Moreau remained standing, his back straight, his breath steady. "You created it," he said. Lafargue's eyes drifted to the corner, where a thin stack of notebooks lay under a cloth. "Not created," he murmured. "Reconstructed, curated. I found a fragment years ago, a novel forgotten by its author. I saw potential for what literature could be if freed from the passivity of ink." Moreau watched him carefully. "The annotations?" "Mine," Lafargue whispered. "And theirs?" "Theirs." A faint smile crept across the scholar's lips, brittle at the edges. "Every reader leaves something behind. Fear, hope, memory. I simply guided the process. Marginalia is a dialogue, Inspector. A living conversation across time. Stories affect readers. Why should readers not also affect the story?" "You manipulated fragile minds," Moreau said. "Laurent, the widow's husband, and those before them." Lafargue shook his head sharply. "No, I gave them a mirror. It is not my fault they did not wish to see their reflections." Moreau stepped closer. "Men died." "By their own belief," Lafargue replied, his voice tightening. "The book did nothing but reflect the instability already within them. They read too deeply, too quickly, too greedily. They wanted answers. Finality. No book should offer that." Moreau let the words settle before he spoke. "You wrote a warning for me." A flicker of surprise passed through Lafargue's eyes. "You read it." "I did." "Then you understand." "I understand," Moreau said slowly. "That you built a device designed to unsteady the mind." Lafargue laughed softly, a brittle, hollow sound. "A device? Inspector, I built a truth. Stories guide us more than laws or parents. But a story with open threads, a story without fixed endings, forces the reader to participate, to question, to doubt and doubt. He leaned forward. Doubt reveals who we are. Moreau remained silent, letting the scholar's fevered philosophy wash over him the way he might let the tide rise around his ankles. He understood now that Lafargue was both brilliant and broken, two conditions that, in the wrong proportions, could be catastrophic. "What do you want from me?" Moreau asked finally. Lafargue stilled. "I want you to finish it." "No, you must." Lafargue's voice trembled. "You are the only one who can. Others lacked the resilience. You reached the end without succumbing. The book chose you." Moreau's jaw tightened. "Books do not choose." "Not ordinary books," Lafargue whispered. "But this one carries the minds of every reader who touched it. Their impressions, their fears, their secrets, a collective consciousness, a chorus." His fingers twitched. "It needs someone strong enough to shape its final meaning. Otherwise it will continue, unfinished, hungry." Moreau felt a flicker, unease, not fear, stirring in his chest. "And if I refuse?" Lafargue rose abruptly, knocking over a stack of papers. He moved toward Moreau with surprising quickness for a man so frail. "Then it will find someone weaker, someone who will read too far, someone who will become its next voice." Moreau stepped back, steady but alert. Lafargue halted, breathing hard. For a moment, the scholar's expression softened, revealing a flicker of humanity beneath the obsession. "I did not intend harm," he whispered. "I only wanted to understand the architecture of influence. But the book, it evolved. It became more than the sum of its annotations." "Because you let it," Moreau said quietly. Lafargue closed his eyes. "Because I could not stop." The room fell silent except for the faint ticking of a small clock buried beneath stacks of paper. Moreau watched the scholar, watched the tremor in his hands, the twitch at the corner of his mouth. He saw a man fractured by his own creation, a prisoner to the labyrinth he designed. "Where is your original manuscript?" Moreau asked. Lafargue's eyes opened slowly. "Burned." "Why? So it would no longer contradict what the book had become?" Moreau exhaled softly, sensing the end of the path at last. "You will come with me," he said. Lafargue shook his head. "I cannot leave. The threads, the voices." He gestured weakly to the papers around him. "If I step outside, I will unravel." "You need help," Moreau said, "and this city needs protection from what you've created." Lafargue laughed again, a sound steeped in despair. "I'm not leaving." "You are," Moreau said firmly. The scholar swallowed, then whispered in a trembling voice, "Then promise me something." Moreau waited. "When you destroy it, do not read the final sentence again." The inspector held his gaze. "I make no promises." Lafargue sank into his chair, the fight gone from him. Moreau moved forward, placing a steady hand on the man's shoulder. Lafargue did not resist when Moreau guided him toward the door. As they left the baindery, the fog parted slightly, revealing the faint glow of the distant river. Moreau felt the weight of the case settling into his bones. Not heavy, but unavoidable, like the quiet ache after an old wound. The inspector delivered Lafargue into the care of the appropriate authorities, giving only the necessary details. He did not reveal the book's nature, nor the extent of its marginalia. Some truths were safer in shadows. Later, much later, Moreau returned to his office at the Quai des Orfèvres. The building was quiet. The lamps dimmed. The book remained on his desk, closed now, still, waiting. He stood over it for a long time, the fog pressing softly against the windows, the city breathing in hushed rhythms outside. The book seemed smaller than before, almost harmless, a simple object bound in leather. He reached for it, hesitated, then withdrew his hand. Not out of fear, but because some stories end not with the final sentence in a book, but with the choice not to read it. Moreau turned off the lamp, took his coat, and stepped into the corridor. The Seine awaited him outside, its waters carrying the city's secrets beneath ripples of silver grey. As he walked home through the fog, the inspector felt a strange peace settle over him. Not the peace of certainty, but the peace of knowing when to leave a mystery intact. Behind him, the lamps flickered. Ahead, the river murmured softly. Paris exhaled, and the book remained silent,